for whatever reason, whether it was political to gain the favor of the Jews, or whether he had some type of particular hatred against the Christians of that day because Jesus rose from the dead. We don't really know the reason, but the backstory is that he had Peter arrested, which is what we're going to read in Acts chapter 12, verse 1. And so here we go. It says, "Now at about that time, Herod the king laid hands on some who belonged to the church in order to mistreat them. And he had James, the brother of John, put to death with a sword. And when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. Now it was during the days of unleavened bread. And when he had seized him," verse 4, "he put him," that's Peter, "he put Peter into prison, delivering him to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending after the Passover to bring him out before the people. So Peter was kept in the prison, but prayer for him was being made fervently by the church of God." So let's stop right there and let's go over and see what we got so far for how this relates to us. For our purposes today, Herod is going to represent Satan to us, because Satan is the enemy of the Christian. Satan is the enemy of the people of God. He's the enemy of all mankind, because all of mankind was put into a higher position of authority than him when he was cast out of heaven. That's why he deceived Adam. That's why he deceived Eve. That's why Adam fell into sin, so that he could usurp the authority that God had given man. Ever since that time, Satan has struggled. I shouldn't say has struggled, but Satan has strived to maintain that control over the earth and the people of the earth. That's why he is called the prince of the power of the air. He's been cast down to the earth by God when he was thrown out into heaven, and he is, bottom line, the enemy of our souls. And just like Herod right here was attacking Peter and James and other Christians, Satan attacks us in our here and now. And so just as Herod already had a history of killing Christians, right? We read in verse 2 that he had James, the brother of John, put to death with a sword. Satan also has a history of having Christians destroyed. And in verse 3 and 4, Peter was put into prison under heavy guard. It said that he was delivered to 4 squads of soldiers. Now those soldiers, those 4 squads were called quaternions, and that was 4 men per quaternion, or 4 men per squad. So there were 16 men guarding this nonviolent offender. So 16 men are guarding this man, and not only is he being guarded, but he was being guarded for one purpose, and one purpose only, so that he could ultimately be destroyed. He was being guarded and put into bondage so that he could be destroyed. Now, so he's been... In verse 5, we see that he has been put into prison. In verse 4, he's been put into prison, and he's being guarded, and so he is now in a place of bondage. Now, let's see if I can make this relate a little bit more to us. What is bondage? Bondage is slavery or involuntary servitude. More appropriately to our definition today is that bondage is a state of being bound or subjected to some external power or control. Now, people are controlled and bound by many things. We actually just saw in the video some of those things. People are in bondage to things like addiction or poor self-image. They are in bondage to old hurts, bitterness, loneliness, sorrow, fear. Bondage has many different types of chains, and often more than one thing binds us. People that are bound with low self-esteem are often also bound with chains of painful past experiences, chains of fear, chains of regret. The addict is not only bound by the addiction to the substance or to the activity, but they are also bound by chains of guilt. They are bound by chains of self-loathing and chains of hopelessness. And so to be in bondage is to be utterly at the mercy of whatever it is that's chaining you down. You're not there willingly, but by golly, you are definitely there, and there is no escape. And that's exactly where we see Peter at. He is in a place that he doesn't want to be. He's being guarded. There's not going to be any escape. And then we read this in verse 5. So Peter was kept in prison, but prayer for him was being made fervently by the church of God. I love that word, but. If you have your Bible and you're following along, take a magic marker or a pen and just circle, but. He's in prison, but God's about to move. And so prayer was being made for him. You know, when I read the day that I read this, I wrote in the margin of my Bible, it says, hopeless situations are not hopeless with prayer. No matter how hopeless the situation is, it's really not hopeless when we put prayer to it. And this one verse alone, if we just stopped right here and concentrated on this one verse, it wouldn't hurt us at all. But this one verse really does need our full attention. And here's what we need to understand about prayer. Prayer always changes something. Prayer always, prayer always changes something. It may change the circumstance, it may change the person in the circumstance, but prayer always changes something. Now, the Bible teaches us throughout the Bible that God always listens to the voice of his children when they pray. He's that good father that we sang about. A good father listens to his child. A good mother listens to their child. That's our good father, listens to everything that we say to him. And the Bible also gives us example after example of prayers that are spoken and then answered, because prayer always changes something. And so as Christians, no matter how bleak the circumstance is, it is our job to pray fervently for ourselves and for each other. And so prayer is being made for him fervently, even though he's in prison. And then we read this in verse 6. It says, on the very night when Herod was about to bring him forward, Peter was sleeping between two soldiers, bound with two chains, and guards in front of the door were watching over the prison. And here's what I want you to see about that. When we are praying, and I said prayer changes everything, prayer always changes something. When in verse 6, we see that God shows up. Right? It says on that very night. You see, there is never a time when we're praying, there is never a time that is too late for God to answer our prayers. It may come down to the 11th hour of a situation. This was the 11th hour. In the morning, Peter was going to be killed. This is it. There is no waiting after this. This is the 11th hour of this situation. But I want you to think about this. My God and your God, he created time. Time is at his mercy. He's not controlled by it. He controls all of time. And so he holds the power of time in hand, and there's never a time that is too late for God. We see in the New Testament examples of people dying, and everyone thinks, well, it's too late. We're going to bury him now. Remember Martha and Mary, and Lazarus was dead, and 3 days after Lazarus was dead, Jesus came to the tomb, and Martha said, where have you been? Why weren't you here 3 days ago? And Jesus is like, hey, don't sweat it. Lazarus, come forth. You see, for the God that controls all of time, there is never a time that is too late for God to answer. And so when we think it's too late, Jesus shows up and he'll bring that individual back to life. And so it's our job to pray, but it's God's job to move when he sees fit. Okay? So this is the 11th hour. Prayer always changes something. In this case, the circumstances in Peter's life are about to change. So let's get the whole picture again. I don't want to get too far away. Peter's in bondage, right? Life as he knows it is about to end. He is imprisoned. Did you read it? It says he's imprisoned by more than one chain. And he's surrounded by people and circumstances that want to see him dead. It really doesn't get any darker than this. It really doesn't get any darker than this. And it's the same for us. For many of us, we feel that there is no escape from the things that bind us. Our circumstances no longer feel under our control. We are led by our chains of bondage into places that we don't want to be, surrounded by people and circumstances where we don't feel any love or care. We are hopelessly imprisoned, and like Peter, we have been there so long that any effort to escape or change our circumstances is forgotten. And no matter how pitiful our circumstances may be, we have resigned ourselves. We've been in bondage to things so long, we have resigned ourselves into believing nothing can and nothing will change. And we do exactly what Peter was doing. We fall asleep even though we are bound up. But remember, people have been praying. People have been praying. And now let's look at verse 7. In verse 7, outlines some things that God does to lead someone out of bondage, whether it's a bondage of bitterness or addiction or codependency, the bondage of self-loathing. When God gets involved, there are a number of things that I think always happens, and we're going to see them in these next few verses, all right? So this is what verse 7 says. And behold, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared, and a light shone in the cell. And he struck Peter's side and roused him, saying, "Get up quickly." And his chains fell off his hands. So here's the first thing I want you to see. Remember, Peter's in prison. Peter's in bondage. You and I, just as Keith already mentioned, we all have a hurt habit or hang-up that we are wrestling with that has us in bondage. We are also trapped by more than one chain many times, and we've been trapped and in bondage so long that we're just like, okay, this is it, and we're just sleeping in our circumstances, right? And look what happens in verse 7. The first thing we see, there's two things that we see. Number one, God shows up. Now, in this case, he shows up in the form of an angel. But anyway, God shows up, and then the very next thing that we see is when God shows up, light comes into this darkness. God shows up, and light comes into the darkness. You see, because when people pray, God shows up. He may show up as another person in your life. He may speak something directly to your heart that's in bondage. There may be some circumstance, but somehow when we are in bondage and we are God's children, God is going to show up. And when God shows up, immediately the light of life that emanates from God himself disperses the darkness around us. And do you know what happens when light comes in? Do you know what happens when light comes into darkness? You can start to see around you. You can begin to see clearly. It means when light comes into darkness, it means you can begin to clearly see everything around you, including yourself. And so God shows up in Peter's bondage. Light comes into darkness. God shows up in the bondages of our lives. Light comes into darkness. He comes into the center of our bondage. He comes right where we're at, where we're bound and in despair. And with it, he brings light to help us see clearly just how bad there is. But there's one problem with this scenario. Yes, God has shown up in the form of an angel. Light has come into darkness. But do you know what the problem is? Peter's still asleep. Peter is still asleep, right? He's still asleep. He's been in bondage so long that even though God is now in this place, and even though the light of his presence is shining out, Peter doesn't see it because he's asleep in his chains. Now that describes a lot of us today. That describes a lot of us today. Some of us have been in bondage to things since junior high or before junior high. Some have become affected and bound up in relationships that ended long ago, but the chains that hurt you then are still hurting you and hanging on to you today. Some of you became into bondage when you looked in the mirror many years ago and you began to wonder why you weren't like everyone else. And those chains have been attached to you. Those chains of bondage have been attached to you so long that we have grown accustomed to how they limit us. We have grown accustomed to how they hold us back and how they weigh us down. For some of us, we have been in bondage to some things for so long in our lives it feels normal. We rise and sleep, live and die as slaves to the very thing that Jesus died to set us free from. We're in bondage, and we need to be set free. And so what does the angel do, right? It says in verse 7, the angel of the Lord suddenly appeared, light shone in the cell, and what did he do? Wake up! He gave Peter a wake-up moment. A wake-up moment. That's what the angel did. He gave him a wake-up moment. The angel, it says in verse 7, that it struck his side. And that means to us that when we have fallen asleep in the circumstances of our bondage, when we've grown used to being this way and we don't think there's ever going to be a way free from the things that we feel, and God shows up and the light comes into the darkness, God gives us a wake-up moment. God gives us a wake-up moment, and when he gives us that wake-up moment, he'll use something or someone to open our eyes to the light that is now in that place that allows us to clearly see. He gives us that wake-up moment, and then look what he does in verse 7. It says that the angel struck Peter's side and roused him, right? When's the last time you got roused about being in bondage to things that are destroying you? When's the last time you got upset about the fact that you can't look in the mirror without When's the last time you got upset about the sin that keeps you in prison? When's the last time you got upset about how you've been robbed of love and peace and security and hope because you've believed lies and you've fallen into things and now you're trapped in them, you don't know how to get free? When was the last time you woke up? Get up, Peter. Get up, Peter. And what does he say? He doesn't just kick him in the side. He says, get up. He says, move. Move. Get up and move. Read it again. Verse 7, the angel of the Lord suddenly appeared and light shone in the cell. And he struck Peter's side and he roused him. He said, get up quickly. Get up quickly. And Peter got up quickly and his chains fell off of his hands. And so here's what God does. Not only does God come into the darkness, not only does he bring light, not only does he give us a wake-up call, he tells us something. He says, get up and move. Move quickly. Move quickly. He challenges us to change our position. To change our position. Move. God comes into our bondage with light. We can clearly see our circumstances, and he says, don't stay where you're at, but move out of them. Move right here and right now and move out. And you know what? Right here is where so many people fail in escaping from bondage. Right here is where so many people bite the dust when it comes to getting the freedom that God wants us to have. And here's why. Because we allow fear to override what we clearly see happening in our lives. We allow apathy to keep us in the same place. But did you notice in the verse the angel didn't pick him up? The angel woke him up, but he didn't pick him up. And here's why. This moving quickly is something that Peter had to do for himself. And it's the same with you and I. When God comes into our circumstance with light that allows us to see clearly, when he gives us that wake-up call and he tells us to move quickly, he has done everything that he can do for you and I. He has done everything that he can do for you and I. The next move is up to you. The next move to get up and move is up to you. Here's the one thing that's for sure. If you do not move quickly, you will die in that bondage. If you don't move quickly, you're going to die. It may not be tomorrow, but it is inevitable that if you don't take advantage of the light of God shining in your life in that moment, you will never get out of the bondage that you're in alive. If Peter didn't get up and get moving, the one thing that was sure was that come morning, he was going to be dead. And it's the same for you and I. When God gives you that wake-up call and tells you to move, the choice is actually pretty simple. You can either move or die. You can either move or die. Right now, in this church, God is giving some of you a wake-up call. Right now, as we've been talking, God has spoken to your heart about the bondage that you're in. Bondage that has perhaps been with you since you were a child. Bondage that has happened to you since you were an adult. Bitterness that you don't know how to get free from. Anger that you don't know how to resolve. Unforgiveness that eats at you like an acid. That's bondage. And as we've been talking about it, light has been coming into that darkness that has you ensnared. And you see what I'm saying is true. And now God has given you a wake-up call. And he's saying, get up and move. Get up and move. I can tell you for me, when it came to the beginning of my recovery from addiction, my wake-up call came to me in the form of my wife when she caught me using dope that she didn't know that I was using. And she said, if you don't get this straightened up, me and my kids are gone. That was my wake-up call. And I knew then that I did not want to lose my family. And so I said, okay, I'm going to move. I'm going to move. What's your wake-up call have to be? Go ahead, ask yourself. Just ask yourself. Do that very quick self-inventory of who you are and what you are up to this point in your life, whether you're 20, 30, 40, 50, 70, 80 years old. Do that inventory in your life right now. What has you in bondage? What is it? Is it insecurity? Is it self-esteem where you have no self-esteem, where you have no confidence that you can do anything that you could ever do? Is there just this sense of failure that no matter what you've done, it'll always be a failure? What is that thing that is holding you in bondage? Now that the light of God is shining in your life and my life right now, what is that thing that has you bound up? God's bringing it to our attention right now. But the next move is ours. The next move is ours. But you know what's amazing? Look what happens at the end of verse 7. The angel of the Lord comes, right? The angel of the Lord comes. Light shines in the cell. Wakes Peter up. Challenges him to get up and move quickly. And Peter does just that. He stands up. Peter moves. He stands up. He moves. And as soon as he stands up, the chains that have been holding him for so long just fall off. They just fall off. Isn't that amazing? That's awesome. He stood up. When he moved, the chains fell off. And the message is actually pretty simple to see. And here's what the message is. When we are in bondage to something and God gives us that wake-up call, every move towards obedience to God brings a measure of freedom in our lives. When God gives you a wake-up call on whatever that subject is in your life, every move that you make in obedience towards God will bring a measure of freedom into your life. Everything that Peter stood up, the chains fell off. But where's Peter? Where is Peter? Peter, the chains might be off, but is he out of the woods yet? No. Peter is still in prison. There's 2 guards that he's chained to. There's 2 guards right outside the door, and there's 12 others that are scattered through the prison. But here's the deal. Because he moved, a measure of freedom was given to him by God. That's important for us. That's important for us to know that God will reward our obedience, right? God will honor when we take those steps to follow him. He'll honor it, all right? And so these chains fall off, and Peter moves, the chains fall off, and believe it or not, right now, when he has now stood up and the chains fall off, this is where his journey towards freedom actually begins. This is where the journey begins. He's still in prison, and he still has a long way to go. But this is where the journey begins. Now let's move on into verse 8. The angel said to him, gird yourself, put on your sandals, and he did so. And he said to him, the angel speaking to Peter, he said to him, wrap your cloak around you and follow me. So what was the angel telling Peter to do? He was telling Peter to prepare for the rest of the journey towards freedom. That's what he was doing. telling Peter to prepare for the rest of the journey. You see, it would be great if we could just do one thing in our lives and 5, 10, 20, 30, 40 years of chains of bondage would just fall away and we'd be free. Wouldn't that be great? Those things that have shackled us for so many years that we think are always going to be there, they've always been there, they feel like they're never going to away. We've tried to get rid of them and they never go away and we just think we're stuck with them. Wouldn't it be great if I just did one thing in obedience to God and all of those chains of 30, 40 years fell away and I'd be free? It's not how it works. It's not how it works. My psychologist friend, Dr. Doug Wiggin, who I went to see after I got my wake-up call. I started to go see this psychologist because I was more or less insane. And I would go to see him twice a week, and I did that for probably 2 years, twice a week. And then it went down to, I went to see him once a week for a year, and I just kept going to see him. And I sometimes, I'm paying all this money out of pocket, guys, and I'm thinking, oh man, when's this ever going to end, And I would say, Doc, when's this all going to be done? And he said, Jim, it took you 25 years to get here. It's going to take you 25 years to get out. That kind of made sense to me, right? That's kind of how it is. Just because those chains are off doesn't mean we're completely free, right? The chains have fallen off. The initial steps of freedom have been taken. The chains have fallen off. We're experiencing some measure of freedom, but now we still got to get ourselves out of all of those prisons. We've got to get ourselves out of there. And so like Peter and like me, responding call and moving towards life is just the first step. And when we take that first step and the chains fall off and fall away and we begin to sense freedom in our lives, it feels great. But then we must prepare for the rest of the journey. We must prepare our hearts to go through all the twists and turns that the prison that holds us has. We must prepare ourselves to face our fears and challenges and the hurdles and the blockages that are going to be in front of us. For those women in bondage over body image issues and self-loathing, God shows up in your life today with light, and he gives you a glimpse of yourself as he sees you, and it feels great. You hear that wake-up call, and it feels great to realize that you are loved and precious just as you are in the sight of God, and that partial freedom that you experience from that self-loathing feels great. But now you must prepare for the rest of the journey, and the rest of the journey means tomorrow morning you're going to look in the mirror again, and those old chains are going to try to attach themselves to you again. And if you don't prepare yourself for the rest of the journey towards freedom, you will be bound again. I talked to a gentleman the other day, and I know he's an alcoholic. And I said, how long has it been since you had a drink? He said, 2 months. I thought, okay, good. Are you going to recovery? No. Okay. You know what that tells me? He's trying to do, out of sheer willpower, something that needs God's help, right? And yeah, maybe he's been clean for 2 months, but if he doesn't prepare for the rest of the journey, he's probably not going to make it to the end. Guys, we have our problems too. Sometimes we don't feel we measure up as a man should be. We don't feel we provide enough. We feel pressures to do this, pressures to have that. And we're the same way. Women may look in the mirror and they see one thing, and guys, we look in the mirror and we see another thing. And we compare ourselves to others and we say, oh, I wish. And we've done it so long that we just kind of take it for granted. But right now is a wake-up call that God created you men and God created you women in a very specific, unique way. Yes, he created you and he threw away the mold, not because it was imperfect, but so he could perfectly love you uniquely as he created you to be. And as the light shines and he says, he loves me right now, just like this, yeah. And that freedom feels good, doesn't it? But if you don't prepare for the rest of the journey, you're going to look in the mirror tomorrow. And those lies that are meant to bind and destroy you are going to come up again. And so in verse 8, the angel says, get your coat on, get your robe on, tighten up your belt, put your sandals on, make sure they're tight, because we are out of here. And that's what Peter did. He prepared for the rest of the journey. That's exactly what we have to do. Let's read verses 9 and 10 now. Verses 9 and 10 And he went out and continued to follow. Peter is now following this angel through the prison. He went out, he continued to follow, and he did not know that what was being done by the angel was real, but thought he was seeing a vision. Verse 10, and when they had passed the first and second guard, they came to the iron gate that leads into the city, which opened for them by itself. And they went out and went along one street, and immediately the angel departed from him. Now, if you take a little bit of time and reread verse 9 again, do you get the sense that Peter didn't really catch what was going on, right? Well, I don't know if this is real or not. If this is a vision, wow, but he was going, right? He didn't know if it was real. He really had no clue what he was doing. He was just following God as best he could. That's what he was doing. He was following God as best he could. But because he is putting his trust in God, God is leading him towards freedom. And do you see in verse 10, they went past one guard and then another guard, and then they came to an iron gate that opened by itself. And as we escape the prison of our own bondages, God will lead us to life if we just keep following him. God will lead each one of us to life if we just keep following him. We may not always understand the route that we are on. Like you may say, well, what does Celebrate Recovery have to do with me? I don't have a problem with alcohol. I don't have a problem with drugs. Well, okay, if you push me, I have a problem with self-image. Yeah, I have a problem with bitterness. I have a problem. Well, what does Celebrate Recovery have to do with me? Folks, you may not always understand the route, but if you just keep following God, God is going to lead you into freedom. And that's what's happening here. And so, where he goes one guard, past one guard, then another guard, and he comes to this iron gate that opens by itself, and if we just trust God and keep moving forward, he will open the way before us. Now, you see it says iron gate, right? Iron gate, iron gate. Iron in the Bible symbolizes the strength of man. Iron in the Bible symbolizes the strength of man. And this iron gate is like the last thing that stood between Peter and the city. And the city in this case is freedom. It's freedom, right? And so, and I'm reminded, no matter how long it takes to walk out of bondage, no matter how long it takes us, no matter what obstacles or people stand in our way, as long as we keep following the God that is in front of us, nothing can stop God from carrying out his mission in our lives to set us free. And he who the Son sets free is... That's right. That's right. You know what else it says in the Bible? It says Christ died to set you free, so don't submit to a yoke of slavery again. Christ died to set you free. Stop going back and becoming a slave on your own. Let's wrap this up with verse 11. And when Peter came to himself, guess this is Israel, right? Peter came to himself and he said, now I know for sure. Now I know for sure that the Lord has sent forth his angel and rescued me from the hand of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting. You know why I like that verse? It reminds me of how limited my vision is. When I received my wake-up call to get free from addiction, and I began this journey of recovery and getting free from the bondages of just one bondage. Addiction was just one of the chains that was on me, right? I didn't know where it was going to end. It was just like, I'm just going to keep doing this. I don't know when this is all going to be over. I don't know if this is real or not. I don't know if I'll make it to the end. I mean, I had all these things going, but it was when I looked back. It's when I looked back at where I started from and to where I have come that I recognized, wow, God was leading me. God was there. Now, in the process, I wasn't always sure if I was following God. I wasn't always sure if I was doing the right thing. I thought I was. I was just following God the best I can. I'm just trying to do this. I want this freedom. I don't want to fall back into that again. I want to keep moving. But I wasn't sure until I looked back and was, wow, there he was. When I thought he wasn't there, he was right there in front of me. Do you know that iron gate that we just read about in verse 11? It didn't open itself, right? There were no remote-controlled gates. But there's a God that can move mountains. And do you know that if Peter wouldn't have followed the angel, that iron gate never would have opened? What was the point? Peter stayed in the bondage. We may not always know where that journey's going to end, but I can tell you this, God does. And to beat the scripture to death that I've shared with you so many times before from the book of Jeremiah, God says, I know the plans that I have for you, plans for good and not evil, plans for life and not death. This is the God that we are to follow. In our church, we are bound with bondages. We are. That's why we're doing Celebrate Recovery. Yes, in Pennsylvania is the 4th highest in the nation as far as heroin overdoses, things like that. Yes, we're doing it for the addicts, but we got to understand that we're bound up too with hurts, habits, and hang-ups. And that's why we're doing it, because God wants you and I to be free. And for those of us today that got a wake-up call, get up and move. Don't stay where you're at. Stop making excuses when God says, I have the keys of life and death in my hands. Okay, that's nice, but I'll just sit here in my misery. How stupid can we be? And yet we do that. That journey towards freedom was almost dreamlike. We never quite know where we're going to end up, but we can look back and we can see God.